So the title of my presentation today is O futuro está nebuloso. That's Portuguese, and in English it would translate in something like the future is nebulous. And the broader title is Contaminated and Cosmopolitan or Cosmopolitan, I was not so sure, Imaginaries in Brazilian AI Research. And as Roman already indicated, I will mainly speak today and present data from my field trip that I did last year in Sao Paulo at the C4AI, the Center for Artificial Intelligence. But let me explain a little bit more what I mean when I speak of contamination or contaminated diversity. I'm relying on Anna Zing-Lovenhaupt's texts and works, mainly The Mushroom at the End of the World. It's, I think, gaining popularity in the last years. And I have a quote here from this book, and she says, "We are contaminated by our encounters. They change who we are as we make way for others. As contamination changes, world-making projects, mutual worlds, and new directions may emerge. Everyone carries a history of contamination. Purity is not an option." And of course, this kind of thinking or this concept is not so new. I like how she uses the wording contamination to explain something, kind of a natural basis or a quasi-natural basis of our encounters, that we all bring something into these encounters we have, be it culturally or sociologic biography. Yes, and so those encounters that emerge are already contaminated in this sense. And she specifies this a little bit in the other work with the title Contaminated Diversity in Slow Disturbance, where she wrote theirs, and she's speaking of the Meratus Dayaks, that's a tribe in Indonesia. So their cultural integrity is as contaminated as the biological landscape, and this puts them into cosmopolitan kinship with the rest of us. And I really like how she develops this kind of this idea of cosmopolitan kinship that is already contaminated culturally, but also kind of bringing in the material world of the biological landscape. So if you want to or not, we are in this cosmopolitan kinship, and we'll further build upon this kind of non-voluntary cosmopolitan idea. But what I take out from Zing is that every cosmopolitan narrative is also already contaminated and a populated narrative. More on this maybe later on. Because then again, I also understand cosmopolitanism as a practice, and I am here now referring to Lanahan and Leeds in their newest publication. I think it's the newest publication. Exactly, cosmopolitanism as a practice or cultural form. I could further specify it and say that I am thinking here in this paper mostly about a narrative practice. And again, Delanty appears here as well, and he said that cosmopolitanism is concerned with identifying processes of self-transformation arising out of the encounter with others in the context of global concerns. So now we have again this idea of an encounter, the idea of a self-transformation, and the context of the global concern that makes this encounter special and makes this kind of encounter a cosmopolitan encounter. Of course, when I speak of cosmopolitanism, I'm well aware that there are other cosmopolitanisms rather than one single form of cosmopolitanism. Therefore, I further specify my thought with Appadurai, who I kind of like. I like his writings. And in this book, The Future as a Cultural Fact, where he kind of speculates a lot or theorizes a lot about globalization and the impact of globalization on a very kind of local level, he coined this word of the compulsory cosmopolitanism, and he said that this experience of a compulsory cosmopolitanism is indeed not a choice, but a result of the globalizing forces that shape contemporary life. And he then said that, or writes that compulsory cosmopolitanism becomes a vital source of energy, or can become a vital source of energy, especially enforcing or giving energy to the ability of imagining possibilities rather than giving in to the probabilities of externally imposed change. So cosmopolitanism here is kind of an activation process, an active process that has to encounter a change that is coming from this globalized space we're living in. And I also added yesterday, because I found it really good, this idea of the rooted cosmopolitanism that Denise was talking about. I think it adds really good to this picture that when I want to speak or look at cosmopolitanism, I really want to engage like at this day-to-day practices that people are living in. And then we jump right into my field with this backpack of theory. This is my field, the Center for Artificial Intelligence, C4AI, at USP, University of Sao Paulo. And I took this picture in September 2022. That's on the right side. It's quite a modern building. It's one of the most modern buildings at the whole campus of the Cidade Universitaria. And the C4AI was founded 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, with a big grant from IBM and FAPESP, that's from the state of Sao Paulo, organizational institutional entity. And it is a research center for advanced artificial intelligence in Brazil. And I conducted field research there, mostly engaging with people working in, at the bottom, you see some examples of research activities in the C4AI. And I engaged mostly with people working at the Camel project. That's some knowledge enhanced machine learning for reasoning on ocean data, and AgriBio. Here it's all about finding artificial intelligent ways to deal with decision making in food production networks. So my methodology, very shortly, I will just jump over that. It's a mixture kind of organizational ethnography, because I wanted to focus on the organizational form of the work structures and processes of the everyday working life of the people. But at the same time, I really wanted to focus this epistemic thing, as Reinberger calls it, of artificial intelligence. And so laboratory ethnography came into my dissertation, my research, for famously written by Latour and Wuger in 1979, with the focus more on the processes of knowledge generation. 4 months of field research at the C4AI in Sao Paulo. In this paper, I will focus mainly on 6 out of 40 narrative interviews. This is just due to my process of transcribing and working with the data. And those are the 6 people. What I did was I wanted to give them little pictures, so you have I don't know, something beautiful to look at. And the prompt I used at DALL-E, this AI generative image constructor, was Brazilian AI researcher, digital art, and then the name. And then we have here Sandra, Robert, Daniel, Paula, Michael, and Pedro. And now we will look at some of the the narrations they told me in the interview. So I will focus on 2 findings. First on the narrative positionality, because I really think that when we talk about cosmopolitanism in this very individualized sense, it's important to understand where those people that are kind of trying to live into this cosmopolitan spaces position themselves. And at the same time, on the future narratives or future imaginaries they were constructing on the way or while we were talking. And the entry point would be that a question that Paula raised, Sandra raised, was there are a lot of big AI panels in the world, people speaking about artificial intelligence very internationally, specifically on the future of Europe and AI. And she asked, or there was always this question, she said, what about Brazil? And Paula added to this picture and said, the idea was to become an internationally recognized player in the field of artificial intelligence, a player from South America, a player from the equator downwards. And we already see here's a very high self-identification with Brazil, with this kind of position south of the equator. This is a very long quote. I will just paraphrase it. What Paula said is that the idea really is, how can they, and with they she means the C4AI, dominate the technology in the future. And the idea is that with this, they can take Brazil to a good place within the whole ecosystem. So it's a very broad idea, very big future imaginary that you can see here. At the same time, she says that if you look at China, they invested heavily, so they are growing exponentially, and Brazil kind of is left behind. And Michael said, also very interesting, I think, that where I come from, it's the third world. No? The world is thinking that it is the third world, aren't they? And Brazil still suffers a little from this. There were a lot of kind of that pieces of narration in my interviews. And so my interviewees highlighted the precarious, sometimes peripheral situation of their own research activities in comparison with other big players in the world. And they actively draw a difference between the C4AI in Brazil and other research institutions in the first world, so-called, emphasizing China's special role. And I would argue that, of course, this differentiation takes first place along established imaginations already and their respective realities of national borders, and therefore, in this situation, reinforcing quite banal nationalisms. And I'm using this kind of categorizations. USA and China, they stood out the most as comparative dimensions, followed by Japan and Germany. And already here, I would argue that what is then the contamination that was brought into this interview? Is it at this point already, it can talk about coloniality or not? Coloniality in general is a big topic in my research. We will see why when I now show you a little bit of the future imaginaries. So Paula said then, the idea is really monopolies are getting too big in the world, right? And they don't want that there will only be one power or only a few people that can control the services and the technologies that are being developed. So what she says in the end is we are trying to break this down. Up until now, Paula stands quite alone with this narrative of kind of an active future imagination. So she really wants to go forward. She wants to change the world. She wants to break things up. But mostly what I heard from my interviewees sounded like this. So for example, they said they don't like to talk about the future, or even admitted that it's very difficult to imagine futures differently, like Robert put it. Daniel said that he just thinks it will be a continuation of what was already happening. And Pedro just said, he just hopes that we do better than we have already done. We want 5G internet. We'll wait for 6G even faster. And you see that even this, we will wait for 6G, this innovation or this development is happening elsewhere, arriving at the C4AI, arriving in Brazil. Well, those are the researchers like doing cutting edge research on artificial intelligence. So they showed great awareness, my interviewees, regarding global and domestic power inequalities and crisis, and they therefore engaged in questions of global concern, if you want to speak with Delaney. Gerard. But the non-imagining of glorious optimistic futures relates to the precarious or peripheral positions of the researchers, be it by the framed third world or by thematizing difficult economic and social developments in Brazil. And here Paula comes in again, very interesting, and she said, the future is very nebulous because there are these forces that are dominating. Nowadays, we don't see much of this light at the end of the tunnel. It's very foggy. And there I got this idea of the nebulous future, which I think is quite interesting. And it could be interpreted, that's my point here, as a logic trajectory and or as part of this compulsory cosmopolitanism as proposed by Badurai. So when the past is characterized by lack of power and the present seems to be a continuance of this precarious situation, it may be difficult to actively formulate a clearly positive future. And with that, I mean that kind of the negative aspects of this cosmopolitan kinship come to the front, feelings of dislocation, cultural loss, or anxiety. Of course, in those situations always lies the potential to resist this pull and to resist the solutions originating from a hegemonic world. And the projected breaking of this monopolistic tech world indicates a certain self-confidence in this regard. And therefore, this kind of compulsory cosmopolitanism can or could be seen as a vital source of energy to envision or to procure future scenarios or possibilities. So this is really my last point I want to make. The narrative positionalities, as well as the interconnected future imaginaries of the researchers, reveal a certain global post-colonial nexus, which is primarily characterized by power inequalities and non-predictable futures. And so the narratives showed themselves quite contaminated by global externality, and be it historically, but also in the present, and coloniality. And in this kind of nexus, one's own power was perceived to be quite low. And this led to either a non-imagining of futures, the desire to break up the system, or a tendency towards a pessimistic view of kind of this nebulous future, this out of control future. Exactly. And that's where I come back to this compulsory cosmopolitanism that was proposed as a necessity, as something that's not happening by choice, but you have to kind of position yourself in this global nexus, which is in this particular case contaminated by a history of powerlessness and maybe coloniality. Yeah, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. That's the literature in the end.